Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Today on the show, I'm speaking with Matt Haig. His new novel, The Life Impossible, is already a bestseller, and I can definitely see why. It riffs off a fantasy that many people have, and a fantasy that's formed the premise for many a Victorian novel. What would you do if a long-lost friend, maybe somebody you hadn't spoken to in many years, left you a house in their will? Crazy situation, right? Now, what if that house was somewhere that you'd never been before? Like, what if it was a vacation home in Ibiza? I've thought about this, and I think I know what I would do. I would probably plan to take just one big blowout vacation to this house and bring as many of my friends as I could. I would go to the clubs, which Ibiza is famous for. I would listen to Technique by New Order, recorded in Ibiza in 1989. And then, after about a week, I would start researching Spanish real estate law, because owning property in a foreign country is just not actually a responsibility that I'm that eager to take on. Now, this idea of being left a house in Ibiza by someone you haven't spoken to in years, it's actually the premise of Matt Haig's latest novel, The Life Impossible. Matt Haig has written fiction, nonfiction, and even children's literature. You may already know him for his novel, The Midnight Library, which became wildly popular on TikTok during the pandemic, or for his memoir, Reasons to Stay Alive. In his fiction, Matt has often incorporated magical realism, dark humor, complex characters, and a lot of optimism. And those elements are all present in The Life Impossible. Matt was recently in Canada, and he joined me in the studio in Toronto. Just a note before we begin, our conversation touches on topics including depression and suicide. Please listen with care. Hi, Matt. Welcome to Bookends.
Hi, Mattea. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
So I want to start by diving a little bit more into the premise of The Life Impossible. The book kicks off with Grace Winters, your protagonist, finding out that this long-lost friend of hers had left her a house in Ibiza, sort of unclear why. Like, they hadn't spoken in a long time. Grace had done this act of kindness to Christina a long time ago, but it seems sort of like out of the blue. Now, some people, I think, have dreamt of having a windfall like this or an unexpected inheritance at some time in our life, and it's a common Victorian novel premise. So I'm wondering, like, how did this specific idea first come to you?
Basically, I started writing this book as a mystery story. It becomes slowly something else and something rather different around the halfway mark, but it starts as a mystery story. And I think for me, as you say with 19th century novels, I find those sort of entertaining mystery novels tend to have a house and a question mark attached to that house. So it felt like the logical way in. And with this, first and foremost, I like to do all sorts of different things when I'm writing, but with this, I just wanted it to be entertaining. And I felt, starting with this inheritance seemed like the logical way to get the reader into the story. And there's also a mystery not just about the house, but what's happened to the friend and all these questions which Grace goes to try and unravel.
So I want to talk a bit more about Grace as well, because she was definitely a protagonist that I think is quite different to protagonists in most novels that I read. So she's a retired math teacher. She's in her 70s, and she's living this very quiet, characteristic, I would say, rural or small town English life. Can you tell me a little bit more about her and also the sort of place she's in her life at the beginning of this novel? Because her life is pretty stable, but also it felt a bit like small to me. Like, she really seemed like she was struggling just with getting older and what that entails.
Yeah, this is definitely a protagonist who feels at the start like they've got their life behind them. They are a bit burdened by the past. She's grieving not just her husband, but also her son from decades before. She has a lot of baggage, a lot of guilt, a lot of grief. And she's this very British, quite stiff, retired math teacher. So she's not necessarily the person you'd associate with somewhere like Ibiza or a party island in the Mediterranean. So that was deliberate. I wanted it to be a kind of fish out of water and also a way of bringing the reader into the place where the novel's set. And yeah, I also feel that it's a metaphor, or at least a fable around recovery. And, you know, in my own life, I've written a lot about mental illness and recovering from depression. And so even though I had my most severe experience of mental illness when I was young, it was still a mentality where I didn't have anything ahead of me. You know, that's what sort of depression gave me, this idea that everything was behind me, that I had no future, that, you know, there was nothing to look forward to and everything terrible would happen. So I think the reason I start with this grieving widow isn't just about people of a certain age, but it's about what we can often feel like if we feel at a sort of rock bottom place in life.
Yeah, that's interesting that it's, you know, it's a character that on face, I think for myself, like I'm 25, I'm so far from being that stage of life. But the mentality of being a person who is really burdened by guilt, who's grieving. But I would say Grace goes through this incredible transformation in the novel. And it really does begin with inheriting this house in Ibiza. Why does this happen? Because it's this long lost friend that Grace has lost touch with. And it seems that she left a really powerful impression on Christina, this friend who bequeaths the house to her. What were their interactions like? And why did Christina, you know, all these years later, feel that Grace was the appropriate person, perhaps, to receive this gift of the house?
Well, one of the ideas I had was that, you know, it would be nice to take someone who's been kind to someone in what she felt was a very, very small way. You know, it was literally spending time with the person when we were at their loneliest one Christmas. So it felt to her like it was a small thing, but it made a big impact on her friend. But during the course of the novel, there's also another reason, which has more of a sort of supernatural dimension as well. But I like the starting point of how we don't realize the impacts we have on other people's lives and how small things can have big ripples further through the timeline.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a bit more about the location of Ibiza, because as I alluded to in the introduction, like my main association with Ibiza is the club culture, but it's so much more than that, right? It's a place that's filled with character and contradiction. It also has these beautiful natural settings. And I know that you've also lived in Ibiza, that it's a place that was personally important to you in your life, and you dedicated the Life Impossible to the people and the location. What is so special about Ibiza to you? What keeps drawing you back to it?
Yeah, Ibiza is a special place. It's all those things you mentioned. And also, even things like the club culture came out of this kind of hippie movement, which itself came out of it being a sanctuary during like fascism, during the Spanish Civil War, during the Second World War. Lots of bohemian type people and artists would flock to it. So it's always had this sort of countercultural dimension. It was always on the hippie trail. And then the sort of music scene evolved out of that. For me personally, I was the idiotic young British person who went there, took a lot of alcohol, consumed a lot of drugs in my 20s, and had a breakdown, basically. You know, I was a young man who didn't know how to become an adult, and I was putting off life. I'd just done a master's degree in English literature, and I was overthinking everything, and I just wanted to get off my head and escape everything. And I became very ill this is way back in 1999, and had a breakdown. I was suicidal. And so it was a scene of a lot of trauma for me. So for years, I didn't want to hear anything about Ibiza. It was easy to sort of leave a place behind. You can't leave yourself behind, but you can leave a place behind and just sort of blame it all on the place. And then decades later, when I was actually going through therapy, a big theme of the therapy was, you know, facing up to the past and facing up to myself and foolish things I did at a younger age. And so one winter, 2 years ago, I thought I'll go out of tourist season to the place, to the cliffs, to the literal place I nearly died, to the hospital where I was sent to as well, and to sort of like face up to it all. And it was a very cathartic experience. And yes, as you say, Ibiza's many things. Ibiza's actually a quiet place, if you want it to be. It's a place of nature sanctuaries. It's a place of pine forests and beautiful forest walks. So it is many, many things, depending on what you want. And I find that interesting, the idea that it's got so many preconceived ideas about it, and so many people think they wouldn't want to go there or potentially even read a book about it. So in The Life Impossible, I'm trying to sort of talk about the place and its multifaceted identity.
Yeah. And thank you so much for sharing your personal journey. And that idea of going back to a place that had been a site of trauma is so powerful. Like I've definitely unwillingly, I guess, had to return to Los Angeles, which is kind of my version of like going back to a place that was incredibly low. And it was very cathartic for me as well. So I'm so glad to hear that you had that experience.
Yeah, you too.
I think, you know, what you're saying of like, people have this conception of Ibiza as being one thing, and it's actually so much more. And people might have this prejudice and think that they don't want to go there. I definitely found myself reading this book wondering, like, do I actually want to visit? This seems like a beautiful location. But I think, as we both know, like the impact of tourism on popular destinations is a very fraught thing. And it's been in the news quite a lot. I think like many places in Spain. I know in Barcelona, there were just massive anti-tourism protests like 6 weeks after I'd been there. I was like, uh-oh. In Ibiza as well, locals are very concerned about the development of hotels and the strain that can put on the natural beauty of a location. Why did you want to explore some of that tension in your story? Because I thought that was like one of the things that I found just the most interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to. It's hard to write about somewhere like Ibiza, which is a very small island. There's no drive that you do in Ibiza that's more than half an hour. You can cycle around the whole island. So it's a very small island. It has millions of visitors a year. So that obviously has an impact socially, environmentally. You've got the whole Airbnb issue, which is a problem in Barcelona, problem all over Spain, a problem in Ibiza as well. It's a very delicate place, which I related to, you know, on the personal level, and it's a very fragile place in need of protection. But I think in Ibiza also it's very complicated because you speak to older people in Ibiza and they remember Ibiza in early days of tourism, and it was a desperately poor island which they welcome tourists with open arms. So you've got a lot of very interesting, well, I find it interesting, issues around Ibiza and Spain's period of self-reflection when it's, you know, because so much of the Spanish economy is based around tourism, which has benefits, obviously, but there's also, problems. Like I was in Ibiza recently and I saw Spanish workers living out of camper vans in car parks next to like these sunset cafes, as they're called, which, you know, you have to spend 600 euros as a minimum spend for your sort of drinks. So you've got these two worlds clashing and it feels unsustainable.
Yeah, I think about this a lot. Like my mom is from what is essentially a tourist and fishing village area is where she's originally from in Nova Scotia. And a lot of these questions of like luxury tourism versus it being an area that has been historically somewhat economically deprived and there's not a lot on the go. Like it's fascinating to see kind of the other side as a visitor. So yeah, seeing that play out in your novel was one of, I think, my favorite parts of reading it. I was like, this is real. This is like actually going on. But there's a lot that's fantastical in this book, too, that's a bit less, I would say, perhaps rooted in like the real problems of Spanish tourism. Yeah. And you alluded to that in some of your earlier responses, talking about there's some sort of supernatural elements that I won't spoil for listeners who haven't read the book. But Grace learns very quickly in The Life Impossible that things are not as they seem in Ibiza. There's this bottle of seawater that she dumps out and it just like reappears with no explanation. There's like a plant that starts growing where she dumped out the seawater. There's this cab driver that's saying all these cryptic statements. How does she respond to all of this?
You know, she's really a very logical, very pragmatic kind of person, which was important, you know, because the journey she goes on is towards the mystical and she has her whole worldview sort of turned 180 degrees. But, you know, for me, I was almost saying, because it starts quite conventionally and then sort of like towards the middle, chapter by chapter, it gets stranger and stranger. And so the fun for me as a writer was to see how far you can sort of lead the reader down this path before they think, okay, that's too weird.
As a counterpoint to Grace, there's also this character, Alberto, who's really all in when it comes to this supernatural stuff. He has kind of uprooted his whole life in order to pursue learning more about it. Like he was a marine biologist and had this like professor job at a university, which he loses to just kind of go figure out what's going on. I kind of felt like I maybe would have a bit more of a Grace attitude about supernatural happenings and like not want to believe it and just be like, nope, this is uprooting my ideas of how the world works too much. But there are definitely people who are more Albertos. And I'm wondering, like, where do you feel you fall on that spectrum?
Well, I find like the Albertos of the world quite attractive sometimes and interesting figures. But yeah, me, myself, I'd like to sort of go with the science. But having said that, you know, if you look at scientific history, you know, it was only in the 19th century that people thought the sea couldn't go down more than a few hundred meters. And now obviously we know about the Mariana Trench and how deep this ocean is in parts, and all the creatures that live there, which would have been considered almost like aliens years ago. So I think there's a balance, isn't there, between being overly suspicious of everything and to have an open mind, which is sort of grounded in scientific reality. So, I don't believe everything I've written in this book, but I wanted the explanation for what happens to at least be plausible within the terms of the story.
Yeah. And you mentioned something earlier of kind of feeling like you were leading readers a bit down this path where it wasn't super weird from the beginning. It was a more conventional mystery story, as you said. I'm wondering, did that sort of natural skepticism maybe that you have and a need for, if there's going to be an explanation that's a little bit paranormal, it needs to at least make sense. Do you find that informs the way that you write magical realism, either in this book or maybe in some of your other work?
Yeah, definitely. I can't just totally go with the fantasy. I need something. Unless I'm with a children's book, because I've written some children's books, it's a bit different. I think actually children are the better readers for that reason. The fact that they will go with the imagination a little bit more. An adult readership, you have to do the work in terms of leading them by the hand and saying, no, this is plausible because of quantum physics or whatever it is. But it's fun to sort of see how far-fetched ostensibly your story is, but how you can sort of explain it. And then you've got the challenge. But with Grace's story and with this story, in terms of the open mind, it's also personal to me because when I was going through depression, and I had years of depression and panic disorder, I had a very pessimistic worldview and one which said I would never get better, I'd never get over this. And so when you recover, life itself starts to feel a little bit surreal because you're living the impossible in your daily life. And, the grass seems greener and the sky seems bluer and everything's more vivid. So it's almost a book about that kind of surreal feeling of recovery when something that you thought was impossible is happening. And we all have that moment at some point.
I want to pivot to a bit of a different subject and talk about music. As we alluded to before, club culture is big in Ibiza. But beyond that, music plays a big role in this novel. There's pop culture references where Grace, as an older person, is sort of picking up on, that person's wearing a Taylor Swift Eras Tour t-shirt. And then there's also some, I guess we could say, older music where Grace hears songs that remind her of her deceased husband. And I'm wondering, for you personally, do you find music, is that an important part of your life for you? Either just outside of writing or in your writing practice? Because it felt very embedded in the novel in a way that felt very natural.
Totally. And I love this question. And I feel like, writers always have to say they're influenced by other writers. I'm as influenced by music. I think it helps when you're writing a novel to have a song or an album in mind that you're sort of aiming towards. With this, it's sort of Fleetwood Mac was the vibe that was going through. Certainly 80s Fleetwood Mac, not so much rocky 70s Fleetwood Mac, but the sort of more slicker, poppier 80s Fleetwood Mac. And deliberately, the references to music are quite eclectic. You go from AC/DC to Taylor Swift and everything in between. And that's also a way to just sort of see the connections.
I saw you actually made a soundtrack to the novel that you put on Spotify for readers to listen to and engage with I thought was really cool. My personal favorite track, Plug, was True Faith, New Order. No surprise. Yeah. But I think in terms of what exemplified the novel and Grace's journey for me, maybe the most, Rainy Days and Mondays by the Carpenters, I felt really set a good mood, especially for the beginning part of the novel. Let's hear a little bit of it now.
What I've got they used to call the blues. Nothing is really wrong. Feeling like I don't belong. Walking around some kind of lonely cloud. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down.
I love, oh my God, Karen Carpenter's voice is so good. She's such a star. I feel like for me, there are some parallels between these lyrics and your character Grace's sense of grief and melancholy at the start of the novel. Nothing is really wrong, feeling like I don't belong. She's kind of in this stasis period. There's nothing actively going wrong in her life, but she just feels kind of out of place and out of community. Do you have like a connection or relationship to this song? Like, what made you want to include it specifically as part of your theme music for this novel?
I love that song. I think even in 100 years, there'll be people loving that song because it's kind of timeless, isn't it? It's just beautiful. And as you say, her voice is like ethereal and wonderful, and I love it. And I think for me personally, it used to be a sign of recovery or being back in the world again after a bout of mental illness that I could enjoy music again. And it tended to be songs that I was nostalgic about rather than contemporary songs. It tended to be things that my mum and dad used to listen to. So Carpenters, Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, that sort of era. For Grace too, I think this song obviously fits her, but she's not really, like, she's not diagnosed with depression or anything, but she's been unable to access pleasure or take any joy from books, films, TV, music, or anything, or personal interactions. So that's another reason why music is a big part of this book, I think, because music to me represents feeling, and when you're recovering and you're able to access life again, the way to do that, of a barometer for knowing where you are on the scale, is to sort of like test your appreciation of music. And so, it's lovely. And still, it's like hearing that song for the first time every time I hear it. It's a beautiful thing.
So we've talked a fair amount about some of the dissatisfaction, guilt, grief, depression, and these difficulties that some of your characters experience. But there's this clear optimism in your writing as the stories shake out. It's not these sort of sordid tales of people who remain miserable. There's often a sort of personal growth or a coming out of that difficult time. And I know that's something that sometimes people have criticized you for. There's this notion that it's like unliterary to have this hopeful or optimistic work. Why do you feel like hope is important to write about, even as there's this criticism of like it's not serious?
Yeah, well, I'm British, so I grew up with this cynicism, which is kind of part of British culture. You've got to be suspicious of happy endings. You've got to be suspicious of pop psychology and self-help. You've got to be suspicious of optimism. You've got to be suspicious of all these things, which I dip my toe into. And the answer for me is that I know cynicism. I know pessimism. I used to live with nothing but cynicism. Depression I had for years, which gave me the most cynical worldview. And much of that pessimism turned out to be wrong. Time disproved a lot of the things that were in my head. I was convinced I'd be dead at the age of 25, and I wasn't. I'm now 49 years old. So that was clearly wrong. And a lot of the other things about nothing good happened in my life that I wouldn't be able to, had nothing to offer the world, that was a burden, and et cetera, et cetera. All that voice of depression is the voice of pessimism, is the voice of cynicism. And so when you come out of that, you want to actively work against that. Now, I know optimism too can be hollow and it can be empty and harmful too. And I think the challenge for a writer is actually to write something that's hopeful, but to do it in a way where you take people who are struggling at rock bottom or whatever, and you get them to a better place, but you try and get them to a better place in an honest way and a truthful way. I mean, the point of therapy and the point of healing and whatever it is in terms of mental illness is to create some kind of perspective shift. Now, people can be, rightfully sometimes, a little bit wary if you're trying to create a similar perspective shift in fiction. But I also recognize in that cynicism, it's kind of like a defense mechanism, a defense against feeling, because sometimes when you feel things, it's painful, and especially if you've known a lot of bad things and trauma in your life. So I think a lot of that knee-jerk response to optimism, especially optimism in fiction, is a defensive mechanism against opening the doors to feeling good things and bad things and everything else. So often when I'm writing against a younger, more cynical version of my own self. But you have to be honest to where you are in your life at that moment, and that's what I try and do.
I want to talk and circle back to The Life Impossible and talking about Grace and talking a bit about perspective shifts. You know, we definitely see Grace as a character whose perspective on her own life shifts massively over the course of the novel. And it almost read to me a bit like a coming of age story. It had a lot of those tropes of she's discovering new things about herself. And that leads to her approach to life totally changing. But she's in her 70s, and that's not normally a time that we associate with people being able to change in this way, right? There's the whole you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And it was so interesting to me to read about this character having this personal transformation in her mood and her outlook at this later age. How do you see it, and why did it feel perhaps important to have this character at this stage in her life showing that change is still possible?
Because I think it's a universal thing. You know, I can remember being in my 20s before I had my breakdown thinking the best of life was behind me. The best of my life was childhood. If you're that sort of way inclined mentally, you'll always be thinking the past was better. So by making her a character in her 70s, so technically she's in the last half of her life, it was a way just to explore that feeling where I've had a lot of regrets for days gone by, and how do you embrace the present at any point in life when the people you've loved most are no longer here and all of that. And that's a question I often have and worry about. And so exploring it in fiction was a kind of therapy for me, to take someone who feels like that and to actually say, no, at any point in your life, you can start again, you can embrace the present. I think it's the human problem of how, you know, we're so hypothetical about the future. We sort of mourn the past, yet we struggle with being our animal selves living in the present.
Yeah, I thought it was a beautiful message. I think a lot of people are going to find it quite powerful. I want to end by talking about a quote from your novel. There's a point midway-ish through the book where Grace calls life a fluke to be cherished. And I thought that was a really just beautiful kind of kernel of a phrase. I guess my question is, do you feel yourself, Matt Haig, not writing in the voice of Grace, that that's an accurate description of what life is?
Yeah, totally. And it's one I can easily forget at times and get consumed like everyone else does with the sort of daily worries and concerns that you have in life. But I think we continually need reminding of the wonder of being alive. And I know it sounds corny and sentimental and all of those things, but I don't think we actually appreciate a lot of how miraculous it is to be alive, to be the something that came from nothing, to be, you know, the existence we're in. And it's a wonderful thing. And like people question, you know, whether these unusual things like aliens exist or extraterrestrial encounters exist. The really unusual thing, the really alien thing is the life we have. You know, the improbability, statistical improbability of us being alive now is something I've always thought about. And I think fiction in particular and art in general is a great way to remind ourselves this is the one thing we get to appreciate this wonder. And that's what art and books and music and all these things can help us with.
Matt, thank you so much for joining me. I so enjoyed chatting with you, and I feel like I could talk about just music all day. So
yeah, no, I really loved it, Mattea. It was so great to meet you and chat with you about this. It was lovely.
Matt Haig joined me in studio in Toronto. He's the author of The Life Impossible. If you or someone you know is thinking about self-harm, support is available. Text or call 988 from anywhere in Canada 24 hours a day. This episode was produced by Talia Cleot and Katie Swales with help from Barb Carey. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk. Our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to thank our radio techs and the whole CBC Books team. They make everything happen for us. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.